Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. As always, I'd like to start at the show by saying a huge thank you to all of our wonderful patrons: Robin, Cassandra, Juli, Kortnie, Tiffany, Mystica, Carley, Kyriakos, Euknecka, Mary, Sarah, Angie, Nick, James S., Moly, Mattie, Kerrie, Collin, Chris, Christy, and our three newest patrons, Buster, Michael, and Kim. Your support and generosity is truly amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. Our first story of the night comes from Sebastian. Sebastian's story is called The Witch's Curse. Sebastian says, "Hey Nick, I've been listening to your podcast for months, and always look forward to a new episode. Since I was young, I've always randomly heard faint voices of people that weren't there, at least not physically there. Not constantly, but a handful of times a month. Sometimes more, sometimes less. And because of this, I've always had a great interest in the paranormal, and have always been a believer. Up until recently, I kept the fact that I hear things to myself, because I knew how it would sound, and I didn't want people to think of me differently. I told my mom, and she then said that she believed me, and why she believed that the paranormal is real. When my mom was young, her family moved to the U.S., and many years after, my grandfather cheated on my grandmother, though up until then they had a happy marriage together. But since he cheated, he always felt a pull to be with his mistress, who was living back in Mexico, and he didn't know why this pull to her was so strong. Nonetheless, he moved back to Mexico to be with her. One day, a friend of my grandmother's came to their house and said, "We can get him back." She then explained that he had a curse on him that kept him from returning to his family. My grandmother agreed to her friend's plan, and that night, my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother did a ritual to break the curse. After this ritual, they were told to sleep together in the living room, and they did without question, because during the ritual, dark shadows would appear in the rooms, and their doors would slam violently. The next day, my grandmother's friend came to their house again and told them that it didn't work. She said my grandfather's mistress and her witches were too strong. She then rolled up her sleeves and her pants and showed my mom and grandmother bites and burns on her skin. My grandfather was away for months, until one day while getting ready in the morning, he dropped his change on the floor by his and his mistress's bed. While picking up his coins from under the bed, he saw a jar under his side. He picked it up, and inside was an upside-down picture of him, along with various hex ingredients and items. He destroyed it and came back home to my grandmother. To this day, his mistress still leaves his favorite flowers on his grave and trashes the ones left for my grandmother, who's buried right next to him. Thank you for reading my family's story. Our next story of the night comes from Sophie. Sophie's story is called Last Goodbye. Sophie says, "Hi, I've been listening to your podcast for quite a while, and I finally decided to open up. I've always believed in the paranormal, and have had a few experiences, but this one was the most heartwarming. My dad's gran had passed, and we had just said our goodbyes, and were now on our way to a big lunch with all of our family who knew her. Everyone was sitting down and talking. There were 2 tables, one for the kids and one for the adults, and I was 10 at the time, so I was at the kids' table, when I saw the door open, and it was clear, so I could have seen somebody there, but there was no one there. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was an outside door which no one had come out of recently. And finally I saw her, my great-gran, with white hair and a white dress, just as I last saw her. Thanks for listening, Sophia." Our next story of the night comes from Tracy. Tracy's story is called Out-of-Body Experience and Remote Viewing. Tracy says, "There have been several incidences of leaving my body and flying above roads and into moving cars, houses, and apartment buildings. The first time I experienced this, I was in the 8th grade. I had a dream that I flew into the back seat of a purple car with a black roof, and the driver of that car saw me, got scared, and spun out so that his rear wheels were hanging over a safety fence to keep cars from going off into a ravine. The day after that dream, I was on the bus going to school, and there was the same purple car with the black roof, hanging just where I had dreamt it would be. In another instance that year, I dreamt that I saw a woman getting raped in her apartment. I saw the men who were doing this to her. I could see what they were wearing, and what they were saying to her, what her apartment looked like, and all the details of this attack. I told no one of this, as I thought it was a nightmare. Within the week, I saw a story in the newspaper of the attack in the same building I had seen in this dream. There are far more instances of this occurring throughout my life, seeing more horrific events each time. Though my friends think this is something cool, I wish I had never seen any of it, and I hope that I do not experience this again. Our next story comes from Tom. Tom's story is called Things I Can't Explain. Tom says, "Hi, I've been listening to your podcast for a few months now, whilst walking my dog, and I've caught up on all the episodes. I really enjoy the content. Keep it up. Anyway, my dealings with the paranormal spread over years of various incidents that range from bangs and footsteps to outright apparitions. I'll start off by telling you that since I was a kid, my family has been heavily into spiritual stuff, particularly my mom and sister. We lost my father when I was 5, and I think it was a way for my mom to deal with losing her husband. Particularly, as 2 years after my dad passed, we lost my uncle, Mom's brother, who she was extremely close to. I remember growing up with them and regularly visiting mediums and spiritualist churches. I had absolutely no interest in any of this. However, as I grew up, more and more strange things would happen to me. One time, a family friend was around, and during a conversation with me and my mom, he stopped mid-sentence, turned completely white, and asked who had been standing on the stairs behind us. There was no one else around, and our friend said he could only see legs, an apparition from the waist down. When my mom next went to church, the medium told her that my uncle had been visiting and was making light of his new situation. You see, he had been in a wheelchair for many years leading up to his death because of suffering from MS. He was showing us that he had his legs back. Another evening, I and a mate were in the lounge watching football when he reached up to the top shelf and picked up a small VW Beetle car. He asked what it was, but I had never ever seen it before. We didn't give any more thought to it and carried on with the footy. Later that evening, my mom came in and said she had been to a sitting with a medium and started telling us that again my uncle had been around. She told us that my uncle was showing her a VW badge and then started telling us a story about when they were kids. One Christmas, my mom asked her brother what he wanted, and he said, a Volkswagen Beetle, meaning a real one. As a joke, my mom bought him a toy one. When she started telling me and my friend, I nearly fell off my chair. We grabbed the car down from the top shelf, and I asked if this was it. When my mom saw it, she burst out crying. She hadn't seen that since they were kids, and the last she knew, it would have still been in his box of old belongings back at my grandparents' house. Just writing this makes my hair stand on end. Other stories from the same house I grew up in include seeing strange lights in my room. I was about 16 at this point. There were blue lights, the kind you got from a laser pen, but they weren't hitting the wall or solid object like if you shone a laser pen. They were low to the ground and very slowly moved from ground to ceiling, mid-air, then disappear. I lay in bed watching them and was completely freaked out. Another night, my eldest sister was staying over. She was in the middle of moving flats, so she was crashing at ours for a night or two. Anyway, this night we were all just chilling and having a laugh in my room like we did when we were kids. My older brother, sister, and me. We decided to call it a night, and they told me to turn off the light so we could go to sleep. Even though I was furthest from the light switch, being the youngest, I did as I was told, and made my way over and turned off the light. As I turned and walked toward my bed, there, straight in front of me, was a small shadow figure, standing face to face with me. It was around 4 feet tall, and was blacker than anything I have ever seen. The room was dark, but the streetlights outside meant I could see quite well. This thing was there, straight in front of me. I shouted to my brother to flick the light on. They were laughing to start with, but after realizing I was being deadly serious, he turned it on. Nothing. The room, however, was freezing, like we'd had windows open all evening. That night, we kept the light on and didn't sleep much. I've got many more stories from childhood to adulthood that I will send you if you're interested. Thanks for your time. Tom, from England. Our next story comes from Dakota. Dakota's story is called Demonic House. Dakota says, "It all happened 4 years ago, yet I will never forget my experience. I and my father went to his girlfriend's for a few days when I was 16 years old. When we got there, it immediately felt off as I stepped out into the yard. As we began to walk up to the porch, I had seen something standing in the window. I just thought that it was my father's girlfriend. Yet, when we went in, it turned out that she had left to go to the grocery store, so I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. As the day went on, I just continued to feel off, yet I felt like the dogs did too, especially when the dogs shook with fear anytime they were in or near the living room or the yard. Later that night, I slept in the living room, yet I felt as if I was being watched. Then I felt someone grab my ankle. I looked, and there was nobody. So I got creeped out and decided to go get something to drink and to stay in the kitchen, which was the only place that felt good. When I stepped in, all of a sudden I saw red eyes from the windows, as if someone was staring in and watching me. I locked the door. I was really freaked out, so I thought that I should hurry and go to sleep, that maybe I could hurry and get this night over with. Later that night, I woke up. I was somehow on the porch, which is weird due to the fact that I'm a light sleeper, and I've never sleepwalked, but I just thought that a prank was being played. So I tried to go in, but the door was completely locked. Then I heard something behind me. As I looked, I instantly regretted it. It was a shadow in the shape of my father, yet it had big, glowing eyes, and I felt an immediate, heavy, dark, and evil presence. I froze in fear till my dad had woken up and wondered where I was. So my father found me and opened the door, seeing me standing out there. As he opened the door, my father had seen why I was frozen and scared. He locked eyes with it. Then I finally turned around and realized my dad was beginning to have a heart attack. I stayed in the hospital that night, and after, I never went back to his girlfriend's house. To this day, I still have nightmares of it. I've also had many panic attacks after. There are more details, but this is already long enough. Thank you if you share this. Our next story comes from Cassandra. Cassandra says, "Hey, I just found your podcast and I'm hooked. I have had so many experiences in my life and was excited for the opportunity to share them with you and others who believe in the paranormal. I would love to send you more stories after this one, but to put them all in one email would be too long. So I must preface this story with some family history. Growing up, my grandpa owned a farmhouse in Michigan, which was actually built by my great-grandparents, and only people in my family had lived there since it was built in the 1920s. This house was definitely haunted. As a kid, I have clear memories of lights turning on by themselves, loud thuds from the attic, and once in a while, my sister and I were in bed in our shared room. Our bedroom door flung open, remained open for what felt like 2 whole minutes, and then slowly closed. We had become used to the feeling of being watched almost constantly, but it didn't feel particularly negative, just spooky as a kid. My first paranormal experience that I remember was in this house. I was probably in 5th grade. I was in our backyard in the pool by myself. My sister didn't want to swim with me that day. This house had a door from the outside to the basement, which I could see clearly from the pool. I remember first feeling like I was being watched, but I just kept playing. I took a glance back at the house, and I saw a man standing from inside the basement door, behind the screen, looking straight at me. He didn't look fully solid like a real physical person does. He looked partially transparent. This happened 14 years ago, and I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. He was relatively tall. He had dark brown hair that was sort of shaggy. I don't remember what he was wearing, likely because I was staring at his face this whole time. My child mind processed his age as something along the lines of a grown-up, but not super old, maybe my parents' age. I don't remember exactly how he disappeared. I must have blinked and he was gone. I didn't tell anyone, because anytime I told my dad about creepy things in the house, he would discredit me. When I was a kid, I had a sketchbook, and I used it often. After seeing this man, I drew a picture of him, including the house and the doorframe he was in. It wasn't very detailed, but I had remembered his height, his build, hair, and face shape. That same year, I went on a trip with my great-aunt and uncle. I had totally forgotten about this incident at the moment, when my great-aunt asked to look through my sketchbook. I said sure. She got to the photo I drew of the man and stopped, and she looked sort of shocked and confused. She said, "Who's this?" I told her that I would tell her the story if she promised not to make fun of me. After telling her the story, she said, "I think you saw my cousin. This looks like him. He died in the upstairs bedroom of the house when he was in his 30s. She explained his dark shaggy hair, his high cheekbones, and how he was tall. She told me how he died, though I don't remember exactly. Just that he had been in the hospital for a while before coming back to the house, where he died shortly after returning. This still amazes me to this day. It makes sense to me now why the spirit didn't feel negative at all. He was just a family member who was glad that someone had the ability to see him. When I was 6, my Uncle Jeff actually died in the upstairs bedroom. After he passed, I remember more things happening in the house, including hearing someone walking up and down the stairs when no one else was in the house or upstairs. He lived upstairs, and when I was a kid, the sound of the stairs creaking meant that Uncle Jeff was coming down the stairs to hang out or just to say hi. I haven't been to that house in maybe 8 years, but I often think about going back to see what I would encounter. The house was sold for the first time to someone other than our family. I often wonder what kind of paranormal experiences they have had with my family members who have passed. I would love to share more stories. I hope this one makes it on the podcast. Best wishes, Cassandra. Our next story of the night comes from Amina. Amina says, "Hello. I have been listening to your podcast for a little while now, and I thought I'd share my experience. My friend Amy and I have been friends for about 5 years. When we were first hanging out and having fun, she told me that sometimes the other side communicates through her. I believe her because she is my friend, but I had never experienced this with her or others. One evening, she called me around 11 p.m., which was uncharacteristic of her, and she was crying, telling me that there is a phrase in her head that she couldn't get out, and she feels that the message is for me. The only problem was that it didn't seem to be in English. I asked her to tell me what the phrase was, and she said this: Kunta kalbi fa ta na di da. So you can imagine my confusion when she said that to me. I asked her if she was sure, and I tried to help her calm down, but she was sure this was real, and that it was a message for me. I didn't get it, and having little solution for her, I thought, maybe this is a different language. One way to know is by using Google Translate. You can speak to it in the language you want and have it translate to English. Being a Google fan, I told her to use it. She spoke into the computer while I was on the phone, and when she was done speaking, she started reading the English translation, which was, "You are my heart, stubborn girl," to which I immediately started crying. I said, "What language did it detect that you were speaking?" She said, "Arabic." Mind you, she didn't speak Arabic, so her pronunciation wasn't the best of the words. She didn't know this about me yet, but my grandfather helped raise me before he passed away, and he had a very profound impact on my life. One thing was, he used to tell my mom that I was almost too stubborn for my own good. He was fluent in Arabic and many other languages, but he used to speak in Arabic to me when I was a child. She didn't know any of this, not the stubborn, the grandfather, none of it. Once I could catch my breath enough to speak, I told her, and we were both amazed that something like that happened. It is still with me. Thanks for having the podcast. Amina. Our last story of the night comes from Eric. Eric's story is called Man in the Top Hat. Eric says, I just found your podcast and I enjoy it very much. I was binge listening at work when I heard the show from May 17th and the story of the man in the top hat, and I froze. I had a very similar experience, which I hadn't spoken of for 56 years. I was 9 in 1964, asleep in my bed. It was late summer, and it had been raining lightly, and the air was warm and humid, so I had the window over my bed open. I don't remember what time of the morning it was, but the house was dark, and everyone was asleep. I remember that something woke me up. I can't recall what, but for a few minutes I lie awake in my bed, in the dark, just listening. It was very quiet, and the air was still, yet I had this intense feeling that someone was outside the window, even though I heard nothing. I laid there a long time, but I couldn't resist the urge, and I got up and stood on my bed, and with my face close to the window, I pulled back the curtain. Right there in front of me, with only the screen between us, I clearly saw the face of a man in a tall top hat and a cape or overcoat, with the collar turned up. Although it was a dark and moonless night, I could clearly see him in the ambient light of the neighborhood, or at least his silhouette. Later, I remembered that I couldn't see his face, almost as if he didn't have one. We were face to face for maybe 5 seconds when I screamed, "Hey you, get out of here!" He stood for maybe 2 seconds more, and then turned and ran for the street. Suddenly the lights came on. My little brother was standing on his bed. My parents were at the door, and everyone was yelling, "What is it? What's wrong?" I tried to explain that someone was looking in the window, but they ran to the street, and everyone went to look out the windows at the front of the house, but it was deserted. Then I began to describe who I saw by saying that he looked just like Snidely Whiplash, a popular cartoon character, and I could see the looks on their faces change from concern to incredulous disbelief. Suddenly my parents were explaining that this was a nightmare, and my little brother was calling me a jerk, and I began to realize how embarrassingly stupid the words sounded as they came out of my mouth. As we crawled back into bed, I kept playing it over and over in my mind, seriously questioning what I had seen. Could it have been a dream? Did I imagine it? It seemed so real. Then I remembered something. As the figure turned and ran for the street, there was no sound of footsteps, but there was a bang. On the patio outside my window, there was a large iron glider. The sound I heard was the sound of someone banging into the side of it, causing the moving seat to bang against one side of the frame and then the other. I've heard that sound 100 times. I kept thinking about that figure with the top hat, but no face, banging into the glider, and I hoped that it hurt. The next morning, I was out early. I was convinced that I had imagined the whole episode, and even felt a little embarrassed about it. I was going to forget about it and hoped everyone else would too, until I noticed the glider had been moved a good 8 inches, and it was now non-parallel to the house. The reason this was so noticeable was the fact that my dad was obsessed with the location of that glider, and every time it was moved, even an inch, he'd make a point to carefully move it back and then let everyone know he had moved it back and warn us about it. As I said, the glider was iron and heavy and left 4 small rust marks on the pavers where it sat. He could live with the 4 small rust marks, but he was adamant about avoiding more. It was a bit of work for a 9-year-old to move the heavy glider back to where it belonged, and Dad heard steel dragging on the pavers and came out to check on what I was doing. For half a second, I thought about telling him about the noise and the moved glider, but I vividly remembered the look on his face when I tried to tell him the story the night before, and I just said nothing. For a long time, I thought about what I had seen, as unbelievable as it was. I thought that perhaps it was a prank by a neighbor, but it just didn't fit. The prankster would have to be almost 6 feet tall, and who would dress up like that and then creep around long after midnight and stand silently outside a window waiting for someone to randomly wake up? And back then, no one ever kept a secret. More than one person would certainly have to be involved, and who could resist telling everyone how they scared a 9-year-old kid? No, it wasn't a prank, and it certainly wasn't a real man in a top hat. It had to be a dream, and I kept it to myself. One time years later, when I was in my late teens, I was with friends late at night, sitting around a fire telling ghost stories. Maybe it was the beer, or the desire to contribute to the conversation, but I began to tell the story, but I saw the same look on everyone's faces, and I knew I was making a mistake. I turned it into a corny joke and vowed never to mention it again. 56 years later, your podcast made it seem more believable. Thank you for letting me tell my story. Finally. As always, if any of you have any thoughts, advice, or a similar story that you'd like to share with tonight's listeners who shared their story, you may email me, and I'll be sure to forward your message onto them. As we come to the end of another episode, I'd like to say thank you to all of you for listening and supporting the podcast. Until next time, I hope that all of you have a safe and healthy week, and I'd like to say thank you to Sebastian, Sophie, Tracy, Tom, Dakota, Cassandra, Amina, and Eric for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember that no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. You can also get involved with the podcast by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're on Facebook or Instagram, you can find us at Paranormal Mysteries Podcast or on Twitter at ParaMysteryPod. And while you're there, please give us a follow. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you're doing it right now just by listening, and we appreciate it. You can also help by subscribing to the podcast and by sharing it with your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to show your support, you can visit patreon.com/Paranormal Mysteries and become a patron. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, as well as our new Wednesday segment, Midweek Mysteries, are produced every week and are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Stitcher. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.